Well, hello. Welcome to our webinar titled How to Spread Continuous Improvement. We want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us today. I'm Mark Graban, VP of Customer Success for KaiNexus. I'm the author of the book Lean Hospitals and co-author of the book Healthcare Kaizen. I'm going to be our host and one of our presenters today, and I'm also joined by Dr. Jacobson, co-founder and CEO of KaiNexus.
Hey Mark, happy to be here. I'm really excited about this topic. We've been talking about it all morning, and I just can't wait to share everything with everyone.
All right, so what do we mean by spread? Now, I don't know. I haven't had lunch yet, but I look at this delicious Nutella type spread here, and I guess that's one kind of spread, but that's not what we're really here to talk about today. Different tasty spreads.
No, right? Although I'm sure people are eating lunch here, so it's a nice little.
Well, depending on their time zone, they may be ready for a snack now. But when we talk about spread, this is a word that gets used a lot in the lean community. I'll spare you generally the Japanese word, but some people use the word yokoten, which basically just means spread. So we're going to use the word spread. But this idea of spreading ideas or spreading methodologies through an organization, that's what we're really here to talk about today.
And I think also sometimes you hear the word share, and sometimes you also hear the concept of sustaining continuous improvement. I think of all those extremely similarly. So sometimes if I'm talking to folks and they're really talking about continuous improvement and sharing, to me, those are synonymous in this case. We're really talking about trying to get things from being in pockets of an organization across the whole organization. So I think that the Nutella peanut butter visual is perfect here.
Yeah, so we'd like Nutella across the entire piece of toast. That bread doesn't look very toasted, so I don't know. I'm going to stop thinking about food. But back to the main topic here. What affects the spread of these three things? And if you've seen previous KaiNexus webinars, this is probably the only slide that's a bit of a repeat. We've learned over the last couple of years that to have a really robust and sustainable culture of continuous improvement requires three different things.
Yeah, so it's amazing. I've talked to hundreds of organizations now specifically about their challenge of spreading continuous improvement, of trying to get it outside the process improvement department, essentially. And what we find is a really distinctive pattern that if people are having difficulty spreading continuous improvement, they either have a problem with the methodology that they're using, they have a problem with leadership, or they're not using enabling technology in the right way. And I think what's interesting here is that we're going to talk about exactly what we've ended up finding to be the key parts of methodology, leadership, and technology. That's the framework of what we're going to talk about.
And one of those methodologies that we're, of course, huge proponents of and a lot of our customers use is Kaizen, the model of continuous improvement that's so important within Lean and the Toyota production system. Masaki Imai, wrote the book about this originally in 1986. And, Mr. Imai says, I think, quite elegantly that Kaizen is really about everybody improving everywhere, every day. Real continuous improvement, not just projects. Projects are helpful, not just rapid improvement events, but really trying to create a culture that has everybody participating in improvement.
So two things come to mind as you say that. First, to dovetail off of what you mentioned. So we talked about what we mean by spread, and now I just want to take home the message of what we mean by continuous improvement. When we talk about continuous improvement here at KaiNexus, and I would say when we're speaking with either our customers or prospective customers, we're talking about everyone in an organization improving every day. Right. And so if we're talking about, that's the definition of continuous improvement. We're talking about the definition of spread. That's really what the topic of today's topic is. The second part of, did you want to say something about that? The second thing I wanted to bring up that you reminded me of is oftentimes when we think about a systematic methodology, I think we think of what I would sometimes refer to as disciplines of thought or problem-solving disciplines. And so we're going to talk about a kind of the underlying principles that a methodology has to have. That's slightly different than perhaps your problem-solving discipline. Whether you have a lean business management philosophy implementation that you're going through, or a practice, as we talked about in prior, or even Kaizen. And so we really want to make sure that we kind of differentiate that. There is definitely a characteristic of methodology that we have found has to be a part of what an organization is doing in order to help spread continuous improvement.
Yeah, and I think there's also the discipline of leadership. What are the right leadership behaviors that encourage continuous improvement participation? And I haven't seen an organization yet where, with the snap of a finger, some executive said, "Oh, we now have a culture of continuous improvement," where this methodology starts instantaneously in every department, or that leaders suddenly change their stripes and start behaving in a new way, or to effectively roll out, whether it's KaiNexus technology or bulletin boards. I've seen organizations try to throw them out simultaneously into 150 or 200 departments, and I think of it as overdriving your headlights. The organization doesn't have enough ability to coach 200 departments simultaneously, so most of those departments just flounder, and they have the technology, but they don't have the leadership, and they haven't been taught the methodology that fails. So I think of spread as a process. It's not an instantaneous thing you do. It's a process that takes some time.
Right, and I think there's good and bad to that, right? I mean, we've talked about this before. This is a lifestyle. This is not a fad diet. So one, this is a lifestyle, but two, because you don't need to roll out 150, bulletin boards, or 150 deployments at KaiNexus, or 150, leadership, messages all at the same time. It allows you to really start at any time. I mean, you can really so we hear a lot of people say, "Oh, well, we're not ready for that. Our organization is not ready for that." And I think if it was a fad diet, I would say, you might be right.
Yeah.
But because this is a lifestyle, really, any organization is ready at any time to start doing this.
Yeah, we've heard a lot of times, we can't do continuous improvement because we don't have a culture of continuous improvement. Right. Well, the only way you get a culture of continuous improvement is by starting now where you are and working toward that over time. So let's talk a little bit first about the general idea of how ideas spread. An idea like lean in healthcare, or even going back to the days of lean in manufacturing, any sort of new approach, how do those ideas spread? People talk to each other within an organization. They talk to each other at conferences. People write books, they write journal articles, they give presentations, we use the internet. There's no shortage of ways of communicating. But I think it's frustrating sometimes to see how slowly even a really good idea can spread.
I think what we're trying to do here is give context of kind of what is the discipline and what is the methodology or the life cycle of an individual idea, maybe in your continuous improvement efforts. How does that spread within the organization? What I think is cool is we're going to talk about it in the context of actually how does lean and how does Kaizen spread? And I think it's kind of a cool way you kind of frame this conversation.
Yeah, so the high level spread of the concept, and then we'll go into more detail of how do you spread and share specific ideas that are generated through an improvement methodology. But as I'm an industrial engineer. Greg's a doctor, and I think there's an interesting history in healthcare where any of us who have just really observed surgery, or even if we've seen it on TV, the stereotypical cliched scene of the surgeon putting out their hand and saying scalpel, and a scalpel is handed to them. The idea of what was originally dubbed a surgical caddy was presented. It was an idea that came from Frank Gilbreth, one of the first industrial engineers. He and his wife Lillian Gilbreth worked together. They filmed and observed in operating rooms. And Frank presented to the American Medical Association in 1915 his findings that surgeons spent more time searching for instruments than they did performing surgery. Now that makes me think of here in the year 2015, that's been 100 years now. Nurses often spend more time in an inpatient setting searching for supplies and equipment and medications than they do actually treating patients. So it seems so obvious in hindsight that we should let the surgeon be a surgeon and support them in different ways, including, again, this idea of a surgical caddy. It seems like such common sense now, but it took 15 years for the AMA to formally give this idea its blessing in 1930. they finally came around and said, oh, okay, yeah, that is a good idea. That's something that everybody should be doing.
And the same parallel is occurring in, we're healthcare guys, so I'm gonna, at the risk of sounding too healthcare, use a healthcare example. Don Berwick published his paper, the one that we often refer to as the initial insight and observation of going and using automotive process improvement principles in healthcare in 1989.
Yeah, 26 years ago.
26 years ago.
Healthcare organizations need a culture of continuous improvement. He used the word Kaizen. Dr. Deming was still alive. Dr. Berwick mentioned W. Edwards Deming.
I was in high school.
You're gonna make someone feel bad about that. We're gonna get comments. Greg and I both have our gray hair. Me more so than Greg. But so moving ahead to 2013, Dr. Atul Gawande, a surgeon, is one of my favorite authors in general, not just favorite medical authors. And he writes articles in the New Yorker, and one of them that you can go find just through Google is this one about slow ideas. Why do some innovations spread fast, and how do you speed up the ones that don't? Let me summarize a few of the key points, and then Greg will give commentary from a medical background. So if you think about two different key medical clinical innovations in the 19th century, which of these ideas spread more quickly? In 1846 was sort of the discovery of modern surgical anesthesia methods, or maybe not the most modern, but the discoverer of anesthesia. And in 1867, where Joseph Lister and others discovered kind of modern antiseptic practices of different solutions and methods that could be used to prevent infection after surgery. So anesthesia in 1846, as Gawande says, there was a visible, immediate problem. The pain to the patient, but I can only imagine it's painful to the surgeon to have to try to have a patient held down and try to be operating on a patient who is probably thrashing around in quite a bit of pain. So there was immediate visible pain, not just to the customer, but to the person working in the process. And by February of 1846, anesthesia was being used in all the capitals of Europe, and by June of 1847, in most regions of the world. So this is, I think, the days of telegraph and carrier pigeon. And say this is a powerful idea to spread that quickly around the world without telephones or the internet.
Great example of a fast spread.
Now, by comparison with antisepsis, this was not something that spread quickly. Physicians and surgeons were more resistant to the spread of this idea because Gawande said it was an invisible problem that had a delayed effect. The patient getting the infection took time, and I'm sure people can make all sorts of rationalizations. They didn't believe this new theory. They didn't see the benefit of it right away. And Gawande points out that both of these technologies required some amount of change. It's not like the adoption of anesthesia was easy and the adoption of antisepsis was really hard, but there was more clear benefit to the surgeon for the one compared to the other. That said, early antiseptic methods actually caused a lot of stinging and pain to the surgeon's hands. So in some ways, it was actually making things worse for the surgeon, not better.
Right. We're still struggling with the antisepsis one, by the way, in 2015, which is simple hand washing.
Yeah, so. the spread of good hand hygiene practices throughout hospitals.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that people aren't doing surgeries today without anesthesia.
No.
So interesting, idea that antisepsis in many ways is still spreading.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Dr. Gawande kind of summarized in his articles, well, how do you create a fast idea, or at least make it faster? And one, he said, it requires lots of one-on-one mentoring. And we're going to come back to this as a theme later. One of our KaiNexus customers that has done a lot of mentoring with managers in different departments to try to help spread continuous improvement methodologies. It takes a lot of hand-holding, and it's a slower approach at first, but that investment in time leads to faster spread. It reminds me of the Toyota ism of go slow to go fast. Lay a good foundation instead of trying to do things immediately, and put time into it, and then you'll make faster, more sustained progress.
And I think that kind of getting into a point of kind of a tipping point, right? If you're at an organization and you're starting that initial conversation, things might go slow to go fast. Let's say you have 100 departments. The first 10, 15, 20 departments are probably going to take your longest. Your last 10 or 15 departments are probably going to go a little bit quicker because the momentum is there that you're going to, have that wave and that momentum and that kind of herd mentality at that point. But what I think that this one point should be speaking to us all is, and it's a challenge to everyone listening to this webinar, that in order for continuous improvement to spread in every sense of the facet, it's going to take all of us as a community of people that see the benefit of continuous improvement to talk about this on a consistent basis with as many people as possible.
Yeah, and to that point, Dr. Gwande's second tip is that you can't rely just on showing evidence, but it requires 7 touch points, 7 conversations, 7 points of education. And I think, as I've been involved a little bit in sales in my life, there's a similar idea in sales and marketing that a customer very rarely decides in that first conversation, oh yeah, I'm going to move forward. It takes lots of different discussions. Again, there's part of that time investment. We can't just do one training class about Kaizen and expect people to magically get it. We need the mentoring. We need to keep sharing different lessons and have those multiple touch points to let things sink in.
And this is going to tie perfectly into leadership behaviors that we're going to talk about here in a second.
And then Dr. Gwande's third point was to have 7 or maybe up to 7. You need to have key, easy to remember messages. A lot of people recommend the book by Chip and Dan Heath called Made to Stick. How do you make an idea sticky? Some of it's in the language and the terminology and connecting to a problem or a purpose or a mission. So we're going to talk first about the idea of spreading methodologies throughout an organization, and then we're going to come back and talk about the idea of spreading ideas of actual improvement.
So as we go through this, you're going to notice that you're not going to see Lean or Kaizen or DMAIC or A3s. We're not going to talk about the actual principle, problem solving or business management principles here. What we're going to be talking about is, as you're thinking of developing a methodology in your organization, what are the key characteristics of that methodology? And we've seen this over and over and over. And so I'll just jump right in.
Yeah.
Essentially, what we have noticed over and over and over again for folks that are struggling with continuous improvement or for folks that are successful is that methodology is consistent, disciplined, and simple. Okay, so what do we mean by consistent? So by consistent, we mean every area of the organization needs to be practicing their continuous improvement in a similar way. So they need to have the same type of language.
But maybe not completely identical.
Right. So that's a great point, Mark. Notice we didn't say identical here. We're talking about consistent, and it can't be identical because every department, every pocket, every work group, every factory of an organization is going to have a slightly different configuration. Maybe it's going to have a slightly different, personality configuration, a logistics configuration. Maybe it's more of a virtual team. So the idea here is that it's not identical. Mm-hmm. And that's what we often see people do, right? We're going to do boards. Well, they go off and make 150 boards. Well, they think that they're going to be able to do this in an identical way versus a concept of a board. Hey, well, your board should talk about the 3 or 4 projects. Your board should have an idea component to it. Your board should be talking about your 5 or 6 key metrics for your organization. That would be a consistent way to talk about it.
And if we start small and not try to bite off more than we can chew or expect the whole organization to change all at once, we can practice, whether you want to call it PDSA or DMAIC or whatever continuous improvement framework you like, to use that in the development and the spread of our continuous improvement methodology. The first iteration should probably be the worst one we ever do.
Hopefully,
so that we learn from it and get better, as opposed to making that same mistake times 150. You might not be able to recover from that. That's the classic Kaizen principle of make a small test of change. It reduces the risk when you start small and then try to spread from there.
So let me just focus on discipline, because this was actually a point that I brought up, and I don't like to refer to my paper that often, but the academic emergency medicine paper I talked about in 2009 that was published, that was my first observation of kind of Kaizen continuous improvement literature, and it was something that we talked about in our first conversation almost 5 years ago when we met, that when you look at people practicing continuous improvement, they're doing it in a non-continuous way.
Right. It's episodic. It's sporadic improvement.
Right. So it's a great example. We've heard the CEO say, "Oh, continuous improvement. We did that last year. We checked that box off." So the point here is that whatever you're doing, and it doesn't have to be identical, but it needs to be disciplined. So, for example, a lot of people use the huddle concept. 9 a.m. every day, we're all going to huddle for 10 minutes and talk through the ideas of the last 24 hours, give an update on the project.
Some departments might huddle twice a day, and some might only huddle 3 days a week.
Right, and some people, they might huddle or they might get together once a week, and it might be a virtual meeting. It doesn't matter necessarily what the cadence is and exactly how it's done, as long as it's done in a disciplined way, so people are reminded kind of front and center about improvement. And I'll even extend that to your spread discipline, right? And talk about the organization right now, how they have a very systematic schedule and how they're doing.
And what we're going to come back to.
Okay, we'll come back to that.
We're going to touch.
And so, and then I think the last point is, and before we get off the slide, I think the last point here is that it needs to be simple, right? So we are talking to PI folks. It's their world. It's what they live. They potentially have engineering backgrounds. They've spent a lot of time in certification type classes, right? The idea that everyone in an organization is going to become an improvement expert is a flawed one. And I think it's actually inhibiting the spread of continuous improvement. Mm-hmm. This recognition that not everyone needs to spend 100% of their time to do continuous improvement in order to beneficially contribute to an improvement culture is really, really important. And so with that, and recognizing that you're going to have people that may not know all the terms and may not be facile and explain what the 5 whys are or what 5S is, the point is they don't have to. That's the reason why improvement specialists exist, is to help and coach people through this. So your method of continuous improvement in an organization has to be simple.
I think, as Albert Einstein said, it should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. So let's talk about the idea. We're going to share an example from one of our customers to go from what you might call pockets of improvement or pockets of Kaizen or pockets of a methodology in an organization to a wider, more consistent spread. So as an organization gets started, this diagram kind of represents just a conceptual hospital that has a bunch of different departments kind of just crudely mapped out here. And we see maybe a handful of green departments that are really embracing this, and they're doing a great job. They're generating and implementing lots of improvement ideas. They're making things measurably better. Then you might have the departments that are red. They either haven't gotten started yet, or they're struggling. They essentially haven't started. And then there might be some in the middle that are yellow. They're doing okay, but they haven't somehow hit their stride. Maybe some of the leadership behaviors are missing compared to other departments. So I think it's reasonable to say, well, not everyone's going to become green all at once, that some are going to move faster, and maybe some of those departments can help coach and move others along over time. And then we might also step back and think as a health system. Let's say we have 4 different hospitals. At a high level, we might have one of those 4 sites that is the best at Kaizen and continuous improvement, one that's barely started and is struggling, or 2 that are kind of limping along. So we might step back and say, well, why is that? Did one start sooner? Is it a difference in the CEO and the executive leadership and their behaviors and what they're doing to encourage or discourage continuous improvement?
And I can guarantee you, if we analyze hospital A through D here, what we're going to find is A is struggling in either leadership, in or methodology, in or technology, and C is you're going to find an organization or a hospital or a factory in that organization that's nailed it on those 3.
All of those things. So I talked the other day with one of our customers. They gave me an update on their spread of improvement through the organization. So they started back in December of 2014, starting a daily Kaizen process in 2 units. So I was working with them to introduce a methodology. I was along with their key internal PI person, coaching managers in those departments, teaching some of their senior leaders about good continuous improvement behaviors. And they started with the KaiNexus technology. Well, now here we are in April 2015. They've got an active program in 14 different units, with 4 more starting in the next couple of weeks. And one of their reflections, which reminded me of Dr. Gawande's article, is that active coaching is key. When I started with them and when their PI person is out there, it's not one 30-minute session. Say, oh, here's Kaizen, go start doing it. That I spent together with him, and now he's going out and spending 2 full days spread out over 2 weeks with the leaders and the staff in those departments, coaching them, mentoring them, working through the process of generating and implementing and resolving improvements. That you might call that hand-holding. That sounds a bit negative or pejorative, but that coaching and that active participation is key. It's not just about education, it's about working with them.
One thing I always like to remind folks of, and we've done this in healthcare organizations, manufacturing organizations. We have professional services customers that are doing this exact same journey. And so this organization, let me ask you, are they made up of a bunch of Einsteins? I mean, is there some kind of magical kind of thing in the water that makes this organization be able to do this?
They are really good people with a sense of mission and great clinical training, and they're like, I think they would admit this, they're like any hospital.
They're like any hospital, and I think that's the key here, is that this doesn't have to be the 1% of organizations that are great. I mean, getting to this system, into this state, is actually extremely attainable in a surprisingly short period of time if things are done with kind of the right consciousness.
Yeah, and building upon Mr. Amai's comment, I mean, I would hope Kaizen in healthcare is every organization engaging everybody, everywhere, every day.
Right.
I'm glad you brought up that point, Greg, that this is something that every organization can do. And I've found, well, I think in general with Lean or with Kaizen or Lean, it doesn't fail. People stop doing it.
Right.
And I think the amount of effort and that sustained effort and the leadership is the key predictor of their success with either of these methodologies. So to delve a little bit deeper into what this organization has done, I worked with them for a couple of days in December 2014, and I made sure that their PI lead was trained and coached. So he shadowed me, and across those 2 days, I started having him take more of the lead with me coaching him and giving him feedback. He already had a great background with Lean and Six Sigma, but just give him some additional coaching around some of the nuance of continuous improvement and how to coach the managers in this process.
And we have 12 videos that we've made that talk about a number of those principles that you can find on our website. And it's little things like work to implement, right? I mean, these aren't pieces of knowledge that take a PhD to understand. These are just slight behavioral leadership techniques and understanding the way a methodology can be created in a simple, consistent, disciplined way that can kind of explode this type of stuff. It's kind of like I'm envisioning the garden, and you just need to know the right nutrients. Is it going to be the nitrogen mix and this mix and that mix, and all of a sudden you're going to have a green thumb,
Yeah.
So
what they're doing right now, they've gotten into a good rhythm, as Greg alluded to earlier, with 2 new departments every 2 weeks. They do a conference call with one of our team members here at KaiNexus to introduce them to the technology piece, the web-based system, how to get logged in, how to use the system. That's the easy part. Right? They always say, oh, okay, the software, that's the easy part. But now how do we embrace the methodology and the leadership behaviors? And that's where Ron, their PI lead, is spending a day with each department each week, So I spent 2 consecutive days with departments with him. They've decided to spread out those days. Let's come in on a Tuesday of one week and a Wednesday of the second week to introduce the ideas, get them going. And then I like their evolution of this process to come back a week later after they've had some time to work on stuff. That makes sense because he's there on site in the building as opposed to me having to fly out there when I worked with them originally.
Hopefully we're starting to kind of understand that Venn diagram a little bit, that this isn't just methodology, just leadership, or just technology. This is combining these 3 elements in a way where they're synergistic. It's the 1 + 1 = 3 concept here versus any of these done in isolation. We've really found people struggle with.
Or adding together the 3 legs of that platform equals 5, 4, something like that.
Equals 9.
But they keep improving the way they're spreading continuous improvement. They're continuously improving how they do this. And one thing they've discovered is that as good as their PI lead is, once they get to the point now of 14 different departments, even with the technology that helps him see what's going on, the level of activity, the types of ideas, I can see that as a remote coach. That was getting to be a bit much. So they have 14 departments so far, and they've had variation in the impact. Half are rock stars, as he described, half are just kind of doing okay. So they're trying to learn from that and reflect upon that. How do we go back and coach again? But they got started. They prioritize. People ask, well, how do you prioritize where to go? They said it was based on pull from department leaders who had managers saying, yeah, come here and help us.
You mean they have, let's say, 100 departments, 100 pockets. How do you figure out which ones to start with?
Yeah.
Okay.
How do you schedule those out, or how do you decide? And I love their approach here. I don't think you can force this on a leader because at best they'll give it lip service, right, or they'll go through the motions. And you really want people to say, yeah, us next. People would almost be upset if you don't come and help them next as they look to see who their next department's going to be.
There are a couple books you're going to hear Mark and I talk about a lot, and we love Daniel Pink, and his book Drive would explain why, figuring out the ones that want to volunteer as your initial cohorts and making that your system for who to spread to, that's would be a modeling of intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is always going to be a stronger drive than extrinsic motivation.
Yeah, and I asked, well, what happens if you run out of people with that strong intrinsic motivation? What happens if you run out of people who pull? Well, they're trying to do things that help create pull by sharing and exposing different implemented ideas. They have a monthly forum where generally they've talked about their rapid improvement events, which they started with and they continue to do, even with their new deal.
So they're not stopping their Kaizen events during this?
No, they do continuous process improvement on top of the events, but they've started using those monthly forums to also share some of the smaller Kaizen ideas. And that's how they help spread ideas, but also to create awareness that, this has been a really positive thing, and maybe more people volunteer. The CEO talks about Kaizen a lot. This organization just received the top level state Baldrige recognition, and in their acceptance speech, the CEO talked a lot about daily continuous improvement as being a key to their ongoing success and their pursuit of the National Baldrige Award. When he sends that message that it's important to the CEO, people might be slightly begrudging about it, but they're going to be more likely to get on board.
Absolutely.
But then the point, and I started to jump ahead to this point too quickly, to help speed up their spread, because they started hitting those limits about how much can we support, how many people can I mentor. The PI lead is developing and coaching a second coach. So now they think, as they're working together, and now they can start working independently, that they can do 3 or 4 departments at a time instead of 2. So they think what they're calling this first wave of spread will take through about July. They've gotten everybody at least up and running, even if they're not rock stars. But then they're going to come back through on what they're calling their second wave to spend time focusing on better problem-solving skills. As he said, we're really good at plan, do, but we need to get better at the full plan, do, study, adjust cycle, and they're going to get better. They're going to improve the way they improve. And so I think it's fair to say, look, not everyone's going to do this perfectly at the beginning. Get them started, let them learn from their experience, but then coach them and mentor them and help them get better with it over time.
When we were talking about this organization and this kind of first wave, second wave, I was reminded I've learned at least to be functional in a couple other languages and other than English at this point in my life. And whenever I'm trying to learn it, another language, I'm learning one of them from my mom. She makes a very diligent effort about not correcting me all the time. Mm-hmm. Because if you do, you lose all your momentum and it's not fun. And so I think this is a great example of just get people going. Make sure they're not going to fall off the cliff,
right.
But just get them going, get them engaged, get them involved in the methodology of, okay, you're going to ask people, then you're going to take a look at them and you're going to work on the idea and then you're going to implement something and get them doing that process. And then you can go back and make them a little bit better. But if you don't allow them, if you're constantly correcting them and changing what they're doing right at the beginning, they're going to lose interest, I think. So
yeah, and we had a question that came in. I think we should address because it's right on this point from Jordan. Why not have the rock stars mentor the next departments? Absolutely. And I've seen a lot of organizations do that really effectively, and I would hope this organization can start tapping into that, letting it be manager to manager instead of always just coming from the PI group.
And I was going to say I've seen that in our other customers where that exact kind of pairing up. So I'm really glad that question came in to remind us to talk about that.
And that's another way to even further accelerate the spread of an idea. Instead of it being linear progression or multiplying by 2, now you could start getting exponential growth through the organization. I think you do want to be careful. Maybe part of consistent methodology is that the PI group plays a role in making sure that you at least introduce it in a consistent way. Because otherwise the risk when you have a person, you see this in clinical settings or in bad manufacturing settings where I've trained somebody, then they train someone, then that person, when it becomes a game of telephone.
Sure.
If it's just not tied back to some consistent methodology.
We'll talk a little bit about how technology can make sure that that's happening in a standard way.
So now the second thing that we want to talk about here is spreading specific improvements or ideas or Kaizens or what we call OIs, opportunities for improvement. So how do we spread an idea? And I think there's maybe kind of a basic hypothesis that says this. If we've found and solved a problem, or at least made things a little bit better. Maybe we didn't completely solve it, but it's a good change. Therefore, it's a Kaizen. If we've done that in an area, then that problem is likely to exist elsewhere, in a different department, in a different site in our health system, or in a different health system altogether, and our implemented idea might help them. So this is kind of the basic hypothesis. And I think it's very much in the Kaizen spirit to say you have an obligation not just to improve, but to help share and spread your improvements. So, we think about our own work, and if you look at this analogy or the image here, if we've implemented something, we don't want to throw that idea down the well. We don't say, well, that was our improvement. That makes us look good, and keep that to ourselves. We want to try to spread that idea to other departments. And it's not just healthcare, but a lot of organizations, especially as they get bigger, become very siloed. And those silos don't talk to each other in really any meaningful or constructive way to even have avenues to spread ideas if we wanted to.
I mean, so for one, there's this concept that some ideas are going to kind of have impact and reach across the silo. And then 2, if an improvement occurred in a silo, let's get it into all the other silos. So kind of breaking these things down, I think, is an important thing. And I think you can tell if leadership is working and if methodology is working and the right technology is being used, all these silos can start breaking down pretty effortlessly.
Yeah. So an example of an idea that could maybe spread is from one of our customers where it's an OI called procedure room, and it says description of the problem. Procedure room is not stocked with the equipment that's needed. Physicians have a procedure room they're not able to use. Supplies aren't readily available, and it delays patient care. So there were 2 ideas actually in here. Put locks on the cabinet doors, and then secondly, ask physicians what supplies they want to have in the procedure room. This is the type of idea, if it exists in this unit in hospital A, it probably maybe also exists in hospitals B, C, and D, or maybe one of those hospitals has already solved this problem. So this is where we start to think outside of our own silo, to come up with ideas or spread ideas that we came up with. So we try to figure out, when do we have an idea that is spreadable? The PI lead at the customer I was talking about said, the local managers, at least at this stage, don't see the opportunities for spread as much as I do. So one of the benefits of our technology platform is that he sees the ideas as they come in, and he sees what's been implemented in the system and through email alerts. So if something jumps out at him, he can reach out and say, well, maybe that's something that should spread. So that's probably right now kind of a artificial way of stepping in. But what's more scalable is teaching people to see those opportunities over time, and they can get better at that. And then remotely, myself and others on the KaiNexus team, sometimes we see things that might be spreadable, and we'll ask that question or try to coach and help them get better at identifying that over time.
And the implicit design of the technology also helps folks because it kind of reminds people, hey, do you want to let other people know about it? And it makes it very easy to share and to spread that idea or that improvement work.
Yeah. So I think sometimes we also want to think about starting small and then spreading. So here's an example from a hospital. Patient call lights frequently fall on the floor. The proposed solution was a holder or a caddy for the call light. So this is a classic example where if the hospital formed a committee and tried to come up with the perfect solution, they would go and buy a ton of these and send them out to all of the different departments. What they did here, and I think this is good Kaizen thinking, they said, well, no, let's start small. Let's pilot this in one unit or even in one room. Let's try different caddies and see what works. What do we learn from these different attempts? And they learn that, patients also need to store glasses, cell phone, other things. So they learn and they start small, and instead of buying the wrong one times 200 rooms, they learn more by scaling back and asking what's the smallest test of change to iterate and get good at, and then maybe spread something that was proven to work instead of something that was just a concept.
The word caddy twice in our webinar. Well done, Mark.
Yeah. But, people talk about rollout of an idea. So even if they start small, what we often hear is, we have an idea, it worked, we need everyone to do that. And we roll that out. And what I hear people complain is, well, I felt rolled over. They forced that change on me. And that gets people defensive, or it disengages them instead of engaging them in ongoing continuous improvement. We can learn from others, but maybe not force them to copy.
And that change is not going to stick. I've worked in many organizations where it's like, oh, this is what they want us to do. I'm sure this will go away in the next couple months.
Yeah. And, we can think of the model of, PDSA or improvement being never ending. That one improvement leads to another. So our first use of some new idea might lead to a further refinement of it, or an additional idea that builds upon the idea. And I think when we force that change in that rollout mode, it stops the ongoing improvement. People get compliant. They say, okay, I'll do what you told me to do. Their brains shut off and they stop thinking about how to make that idea better. And this is something that I think ThedaCare has done a great job of. As they describe in their different publications, if they have an idea that they've implemented somewhere, they call that an alpha unit. They go and, of course, try to share and spread that then to a beta unit, that second place. But they always emphasize, we don't want you to just copy the idea. We want you to keep thinking. And if you can figure out how to make that better, we're going to share that back with the original alpha unit. So the alpha unit benefits from what the beta unit did, and the beta unit advances the practice. So this is, I think, a better model for ongoing improvement instead of just that top-down, forcing people to do it rollout model.
You get the benefit of iteration.
So we can think about this, spreading an idea beyond 2 units. We might have an initial idea represented here in the light blue. And then we spread that idea to 2 other units. Now, one unit, let's say, is an ICU, which is a very specific, specialized unit. They might need to tweak that idea a bit, which I've represented as the dark blue. It might not be completely identical. They've tweaked it in a necessary way. It's not applicable for those other departments, but it's still an improvement, and they benefited from learning from those other departments. When we go and spread one or both variations of that to other departments, then we get to another department here that you see in green. Maybe they built upon the idea and came up with something altogether better. So now what we want to do is have a feedback loop to share that idea not only with the original department, to go from the light blue concept to the green concept, and then start attempting to cascade that out. And maybe we discover that that idea is something that every department can use as is. And that's a beneficial idea that does cascade through the organization.
And what I think what Mark's trying to show here isn't that a system needs to be created that does all of these feedback loops and then, step 18 of the process is to do X, Y, and Z. What we're talking about here is a conceptual kind of spread of something going through an organization. And this happens in organizations that do things in a consistent, disciplined, and simple way.
Yeah.
And this is just the natural evolution of what occurs versus some huge playbook and complex system.
Right. And even if we think of bedside caddies, that first unit tested a bedside caddy. The second unit said, okay, that caddy works for us. Right. The other department says, well, our patients have different needs, right, so we're going to buy a different type of caddy. Now, the idea that spread was having a caddy for the patients. That's probably more important than every unit having the exact same caddy. So we want to talk a little bit here to wrap up before Q&A about what organizations try to do to spread ideas without KaiNexus, and then Greg is going to talk about a world with KaiNexus. So one of the things people do is what's called a sneaker net. People are walking through the hospital, they see their colleagues in the cafeteria. I've also heard this called cafeteria net. Those informal networks and communication channels where people share and spread ideas with each other, maybe in an informal way. People use spreadsheets. They write up PowerPoint summaries and try to share those files. They email ideas around. They may have bulletin boards out in public areas outside of the cafeteria to try to help people see, oh, here's what other departments are implementing. Or they may use email newsletters or CEO blog posts. There's lots of different things people have tried, but all of these tend to sort of fall short in one way or another.
And I think that was the major thing that we've come to realize over the last 5 years that we've been working and thinking about and developing KaiNexus is that technology has been a real kind of ignored area on how it can really benefit and accelerate and really make the job of spreading continuous improvement much easier for an organization. And we have never thought of KaiNexus or developing KaiNexus as a kind of what features should it have. This is a feature-based. And what we really think about are, and how do we solve 4 problems that we know really that the only place to do these effectively is a piece of technology. And that's a visibility, standardization, collaboration, and impact. And as you're thinking about your technological solutions, and I'm going to throw spreadsheets in there, I'm going to throw SharePoint in there, I'm going to throw bulletin boards in there. Mm-hmm. As you're thinking about what's the mechanism, what's the media that you're going to do to spread continuous improvement, you're going to find that all of those other ways are going to lack visibility. You won't be able to see very easily what's going on in another person's world if it's on a shared spreadsheet or on a isolated bulletin board. Mm-hmm. And if you let people kind of do things in a completely haphazard way, and everyone's doing things, you can't create that standardization. And so one of the things that we kind of really focus on as well is this collaboration component. You need to be able to do multidisciplinary teams very quickly in order that people can kind of join around a idea, comment on that. And then finally, we see that people really struggle with measuring impact and aggregating impact. These are the types of things that kind of the KaiNexus technology solves for organizations so they can really do the 2 things that technology can't do, which is the methodology and the leadership.
And the last thing I want to talk about here is the idea of spreading Kaizen behaviors down or through different levels of leadership. Greg, do you want to talk about these points?
Yeah, this is something that whenever we're talking to organizations and they're struggling, maybe they're struggling from getting it from the CEO down to the frontline staff. Maybe they have one department that's working really well and they're trying to get it to other departments. So these concept of leadership behaviors applies to every leader in the organization, all the way from the very bottom to the very top. This isn't complex stuff. But what we notice is that they need to be committed to it. Mm-hmm. They need to articulate that commitment by communicating it on a repetitive and frequent basis. And then they need to go that extra step by holding people accountable. Mm-hmm. And what we find is leaders that have successfully spread continuous improvement, they're doing these three things. That doesn't mean they're spending 40 hours a week doing these things. These can be done in 5 or 10 minutes a day, but it's on the front of their mind, and it's part of the routine, part of that lifestyle of how they lead their organization or their pocket of the organization.
Yeah, and one of the organizations and leaders that I admire on this regard, a hospital CEO who has that commitment, who communicates, who helps build accountability, is Dr. Eric Dixon, who's been a friend of mine in Massachusetts for 5 or 6 years now. He gets out in front of the organization in a lot of ways, both privately and even publicly on his blog, sharing 5 or 6 ideas that have been implemented and giving people recognition. That sparks more improvement. Sharing those ideas beyond his health system, I think, is really noble. I think a really important thing. If other hospitals are reading this and saying, well, gosh, that's an idea that we could implement or build upon, or even just copy and steal, that's a great thing. And I think that's one of the things that's great about healthcare, is that sense of purpose and that sense of profession that goes beyond just the boundaries of your own health system. So our final thought here, and we'll give you some time to submit some questions that we can address here, is, like Greg pointed out earlier, and we said, everybody can do this. This idea of spreading methodology, spreading good behavior, spreading good practices, spreading enabling technologies. This can be done, and we want everybody to be able to spread their wings and soar like an eagle, if you will. Everyone has the opportunity to create a better, more successful organization.
I think that's, to me, the most exciting part about working on spreading continuous improvement, is that there isn't, this isn't quantum physics. This isn't something that you're going to get to a point and you're going to say, gosh, the intellectual capacity of this organization or the execution capacity of this organization is just not on par with being able to handle this. And that's not the case. I mean, these are easy, consumable behaviors that any organization, if they have the observation that they want to do this and then they're committed to doing it, they can do it. And so to me, we're entering a bit of a revolution. We started 100 years ago with the kind of check your mind at the door, right. and there is this growing awareness that, wait a minute, we don't want people to check their mind at the door. Yeah. We actually want them to take their mind into their everyday work, and it is really infectious to work in organizations that think like this.
So again, on behalf of Dr. Greg Jacobson, this has been Mark Graban. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar.